Here's a little video I'm going to put together, just some personal experiences regarding parts. Also, over toward the end, there are some surprise test questions that we're going to go over, and so I probably should have worn a different color t-shirt than this orange one because it's reflecting on my screen, but I don't suppose it's going to matter one way or another. When I was working, you know, all of my life I had been told for years and years and years and had believed that the parts store was a less expensive place to buy parts than the dealership, because the only time you went to the dealership basically is if you were buying something that you couldn't find at a parts store. And the Napa parts store here in the town where I grew up was my choice. As a matter of fact, my mother worked at that parts store all the way back into the early 50s, and I liked the people that ran the store, and I liked the parts they sold, because Napa parts, you know, in those days were really, really good parts. And I'm not saying they're bad parts now, but one way or another, I always appreciated having a parts man who knew the parts well enough so that he didn't have to dig. You know, I've talked about that a few times before. About the solenoid switch for the, you know, that was exactly the same solenoid switch for years and years and years on Chevy starters. And this one parts guy, when I would go in there and say, give me a solenoid switch for a Chevrolet starter, he'd throw it on the counter and I'd pay for it and I'd go out of there and I'd be done. And then some of them had to look it up, and they had to make sure that all the part numbers, you know, everything was exactly right. And then they failed to notice that every part number was the same for years and years. And anyway, I really appreciate having a good parts guy and somebody that you can trust to find you the right part, to hand you the right part. My son worked at a tire store about 20 years ago back down here, and he was laughing, and he was talking about this one guy that had a parts store, and he says he would send you the wrong part so that you would have that until he could get you the right part, which I thought was really comical. But just about everybody's got a few parts house stories. Well, the first time I ran into this business of the dealer being cheaper on parts than the parts store was in 1983, when I was working over here nearby where I live now, actually at the Volkswagen dealership, which is no longer a Volkswagen dealership now. They do something else in that building. But the long and the short of it was, I was working on the service manager's Nissan pickup, and our sister dealership was right just to walk across the parking lot. You go to the Volkswagen Mazda dealership, from there to the Nissan dealership. And so I walked over there, and I said, I actually managed to, you know, somehow when I was working on, I don't remember what I was doing to the truck, but it needed an oil pressure sending unit. And I walked over there, and it was $2.10, only they didn't have one in stock. I mean, they were sold out of them for whatever reason. And so they sent down to the parts store and got one, and it was $8 and some change for the one at the parts store, which I thought was absolutely ridiculous. If it's $2.10 at the dealer, it shouldn't cost $8 at the parts store. It just made no sense. And I was thinking, that began to open my eyes. You know, I said, well, wait a minute, I wonder how many other times you could buy something from the dealer. Like, for example, when I go to the Ford dealership here, if I buy a battery, I like for it to be a Motorcraft battery. And if you go and buy you know, the nicest battery they got over at the parts store, whatever brand it is, it's usually going to cost you about $120. But for the same money or a little less, I can go to the dealership and buy a Motorcraft battery that's guaranteed for 84 months for about that same price, or I can here. Now, granted, there are times when the dealer will give you a slightly better, and parts prices are all over the map. You know, that what they'll do, usually whenever they give you a price at one of the parts stores, they'll tell you what the manufacturer's suggested retail price is for the part they're selling you, and then they will give you a better price where it makes it look like, boy, I'm really getting a deal here, you know. But what they're not telling you is they don't charge anybody that top of the line price. Now there's different, you know, shops basically pay a little bit less than walk-in customers typically. I got really tickled one time because my dad was out there, and there was this interim pastor at our church that was wanting my dad to do some work on his car. This has been probably 40 years ago. And he says, how much is it going to cost? And my dad says it'll be, you know, whatever the price was. And the guy said, is that a preacher's price? He goes, that's the same price I charge everybody, because the Bible says different weights and different balances is an abomination. What that means is you're supposed to treat everybody the same and not charge some people a higher price than others. But the parts stores have been doing this for years, and part of the reason that they rationalize that is when you're selling it to the shop, you know they're going to mark it up before they pass it on to the customer anyway. And so they basically want the customer to be paying about the same thing at the shop if they're buying it through the shop as they would buy it from the parts store, because that kind of benefits everybody, you know. But anyway, this one here, when I was working this, there was this guy that I knew that was running this parts store. It was a kind of a new parts store over here in town back in 1983, about the same time when I was working at a Volkswagen place. But I was doing some work at home on a vehicle, and I needed a set of points for a 67 Volkswagen Bug, which is different from any other set of points. Or, you know, 67 model Bug had different distributor, different points. They were slightly different. And so I went in there. I didn't want to drive 35 miles down the road to the shop where we usually, to the parts house where we usually bought the Bosch points. But I walked into this little parts store, and the guy threw these little whirl part points on the counter that had a plastic rubbing block. If you know anything about points, you'll know the plastic rubbing block, even if you put some grease on there, is eventually going to wear down, and the points are going to close up or start to close. And they're going to wind up running crappy, and you know the dwell changes and all that. But he threw this crummy box of, on the counter with these whirl part points in it, and he said $3.11. And I says, good grief. I said, that you're getting rich off of these. And he says, so he bows up at me, and he says, I don't make any more than 15% off nothing I sell. And I said, well, if that's the case, you're buying them at the wrong place, because down at the parts house where I buy the Bosch parts house in the big town down the road, I pay 65 cents a set for Bosch points down there. And he started sputtering and spitting and says, well, he's messing the parts business up for everybody. He's selling them for what I pay for them. And I was thinking, wait a minute, that's a lot more than a 15% markup, which a lot of times, your parts are marked up a lot, because that's part of the deal, everybody needs to be able to make some money off of everything they sell. But one of the things that capitalism does is if the store down the street sells you a part that's just as good for less money, you're probably going to go down there, and that's going to force this guy to lower his prices, and so it drives prices down and quality up. That's just part of what it does. All right. This is another one, a clutch on a Chevy that we were working on at the college over there. I don't remember what kind of Chevy it was. It wasn't a truck, it was a car. I don't remember what it was, maybe a Camaro or something. We were putting a clutch in there. And so I called the parts store and I said, how much would I pay for a clutch for a such and such a car? And it came with, of course, the concentric slave cylinder and all that stuff. And they said it was $400, it was nearly within a few dollars of $400. And so I said, good grief. And so I called a different parts store. He wanted $400 for the same one. And so then just for grin, and the brand name was Sachs, S-A-C-H-S. Most of you guys that do work have seen that brand of clutch before. And so and then both the parts houses were selling that brand of clutch. So I called the Chevrolet dealership. And I says, what do you get for a clutch for this particular Chevrolet? $150. $150 the dealer was selling it. That means the dealer paid a lot less than $150 for it. So that means this part was probably about a $50 part, and the parts house was selling a lot more. So whenever the regional manager of one of these parts houses came around, I says, oh, okay, this was not long after that. I says, I priced a clutch from the parts store over here that you're representing as a regional manager or whatever. And I says, and they wanted $400 for it. I bought one from the dealer for $150. Now, why in the Sam Hill were you so much higher than the dealer? And he says, and he put the guy that was with him on it, and the guy got on his phone and started talking, and the guy says, well, as close as I can come to that dealer price is $200. I said, so you could have sold me the same part for $200, but you were charging $400 for it. So why were you charging $400 for a part that you could sell for $200? And he just says, well, we just charge whatever the market will bear. I thought that was sort of crappy, and I wasn't really buying a lot from that parts house at that time, but I bought a lot less from it after that because it irritated me when he said that. Well, a lot of them operate that way, and I understand that everybody's got to make a profit and all that kind of thing, but there's one thing, about whatever having a 400 or 500% markup seems a little bit crazy to me. Anyway, filter price. This was something I just found out. I went to Advanced Auto Parts and I bought an oil filter. I wanted the Motorcraft oil filter. I'd already bought my oil over at Walmart. Probably going to do the oil change myself. But I said, okay, so I bought the oil, but Walmart was out of the filter. They didn't have a filter over there. Of course, their prices are really good on the filters and stuff. Of course, I will tell you about Walmart. Walmart sells stuff a lot of the time for less than what they pay for it. In other words, my dad had discovered the Castrol people were talking to the Walmart folks, and the Castrol guy says, I know flat out that Walmart at the time, now this is a long time ago, was paying $1.20 a quart for that oil, but they were selling it for 99 cents a quart. Well, Walmart will sell stuff really cheap to get people into the store, because while you're in there, you're going to buy other stuff too. And that's just marketing. You know, that's just basically what it is. And I mean, Walmart has a lot of other stuff that you can buy. While you're in there, you may buy a steering wheel cover, may even get a radio for your car, something like that, or a set of tires or whatever, if you can stand to wait for the amount of time it takes them to mount and balance a set of tires at Walmart. Anyway, so this oil filter was $8.49 at Advance. You can look it up now. O'Reilly, it's $8.99. AutoZone, it's $8.99. From the local dealer, the manufacturer's suggested retail is $6.82. All right. When I called my dealer, I says, over here, the one that's close by, I says, if I walked in off the street and you didn't even like me and you sold me an oil filter over this counter, this same exact oil filter, notice how that one looks slightly different, but they both got the same part number. I says, what would I pay for it? And he told me, I think the price that he quoted me was $6 and some change, 49 cents or whatever. And so that's a huge difference too. For the, you know, if it was a different brand of oil filter, you kind of see that. But if they're both Motorcraft filters, they both got the same part number. You know, these people here have obviously got to mark it up, but I guarantee you they're not paying manufacturer's suggested retail. They're probably buying 100,000 oil filters at a time. This is another big markup thing. I'm not attacking the parts houses here. I'm just saying that you need to be a smart shopper. And a lot of the time, if you go to the dealer, you're going to find a better price on whatever it is you're buying. Here's another example right here. I had a belt tensioner that it just popped without warning on the 95 Taurus I was driving. This was around 2001 or 2 or whatever it was. I was still driving a 95 Taurus. And so I got out, and it was Saturday morning. I said, oh man, the belt tensioner broke. So I got on my pickup and went over to the parts house. And I said, I need a belt tensioner for a 95 Taurus with a 3-liter Vulcan overhead valve. They said, okay. So they threw one on the counter and said, that'd be $79. I thought, well, that's pretty doggone high right there. You know. Well, I went ahead and bought it. I put it on there. It was a Daco brand. Put it on there, and over the counter, the Motorcraft tensioner was $55. I asked this guy the same question. If you just sold it to me over the counter, if I'm just the guy off the street, how much would it be for a Motorcraft tensioner? $55. Well, I'll tell you something about Advance, and I asked them when I found out this oil filter was about $3 cheaper at the Ford place than it was at the parts store. I called back over and I said, do you price match? And they said, well, yeah, you know, if it's O'Reilly's or AutoZone or somewhere like that, we'll match their price. I said, what about the dealer? Will you price match the dealer? And they said, let me look. No, we won't price match the dealer. Well, see, when I went back, I had him print this out at the Ford place as an estimate on that part. I went back with my receipt up here to the parts store, and this was Advanced Auto Parts. And remember, I got to remember this is 20 years ago. And I laid both of those on the counter, and I says, can you price match this for me? And the guy looked at the one from the Ford place. He said, well, that's less than what I pay for the one that I sold you, so I can't price match this. So I guess they can only price match if there's still going to be a profit in there. You know, if you're telling me you can price match, but you won't price match the dealer, does that sound peculiar to you? Anyway, so what was crazy was I sold my son that car not long after that, and he was working at that little tire store over there, and he told me that it started throwing the belt. The belt was squealing, and when he sprayed a little silicone on it, the belt would just jump off. And I looked and I said, you can see that belt tensioner that I had bought from the parts store was crooked. The pulley had pulled around crooked, and it was letting the belt jump off. And I don't know how many times I had seen it. I think Daco may have upped their game some, but I tell you what, there was a lot of the tensioners that I put on there from Daco where the pulley would get crooked and the belt would start squealing. I've actually got videos on my channel about that. And I like to get, and here's the thing, this right here, and I laid these side by side up here. That's a Gates, that's a Daco, That's the OEM. Notice the gates in the OEM look exactly alike. Is it possible that Gates makes the OEM belt tensioner? Who knows? But one way or another, this one here looks a lot more like that one than this one does. This one will work, but I would, see this little, everything's different about that, as far as that, other than the fact that the bolt hole's the same size and the pulley's the same size, and they both do a similar job. Anyway, words for the wise, I've always had a tremendous amount of respect for anything made by Gates, and I'm not here to trash Dayco, but I mean, proof's in the pudding. If you have parts that are going to fail in one way or another, we bought one tensioner for a Toyota Camry, and those are really expensive. It was over $100 for that tensioner, and that one was put together so crummy it was like they cross-threaded the bolt when they put it together, and when the pulley would scrape the body of the tensioner, and I wound up having to get a one from Toyota on that. Now, this caveat about the dealer being less expensive than the parts store doesn't hold true typically for like Nissans and Toyotas. That's basically a Ford, Chevrolet, and a Dodge thing usually. But Mercedes and Toyota and Nissan, a lot of their parts are basically proprietary, which means the only place you can get them will be from Toyota or Nissan or Mercedes or whoever, So the European cars and the Asian cars, for the most part, unless it's something really common like oil pumps and or timing belts and just plain old stuff, that kind of thing. But here's the long and the short of it. Always check at the dealer when you're pricing parts, because you might be surprised. And the OEM part in a lot of cases is better. Now that's not true in every case, but it is true in most cases that the OEM part will be slightly better. Now Napa used to have some really good parts that were as good or better than the dealer part, the Napa parts store. Now their prices, they were kind of pricey, but that was a really back in the day, and I don't have a Napa parts store around here anywhere. I would patronize it, but back in the day, Napa was probably some of the best aftermarket parts you could get anywhere. This was a funny little thing here. This is not necessarily parts related, but I drew a work order on this Lightning, and this instrument cluster here would not light up at night. And so I said, well, I'll just put bulbs in there or whatever. But whenever I pull the darn thing out, that's what the cluster looked like. It was a Lightning. And on the flipped around on the back side, well, this thing right here has no bulbs. It basically had this little module, I guess, that fired up the whole thing, and it lit up really pretty. When I replaced that cluster, everything lit up like it was supposed to. It was just beautiful little rig. And I didn't investigate how the thing worked or anything like that at the time. I was in business to fix the truck. So anyway, here's 3 things you don't modify. You don't modify cruise control, you don't modify airbag, vehicle supplemental restraints, and you don't modify anti-lock brakes. That stuff needs to be returned to the factory design. Even if it seems like, well, I can do this, and make it work, it's a terrible thing to go and make a modification, and if some insurance investigator comes along after a crash, even if your modification didn't cause it and you modified it, then you could be liable. It's always best to go back straight factory with the OEM stuff when you're working on anti-lock brakes. Now, if you've got an aftermarket supplier, that's okay too if they've got it, because they've got to guarantee that if you bought it from them and it goes south. But if you made a change in that system, a wiring change or something else, then you're liable to get in trouble. Now, I will say, on the old Ford vacuum-operated cruise control systems that I used to service when I was at the dealer, occasionally we would have one of those vacuum-operated cruise control systems that would surge. And it would have, when you put the cruise on, it would surge. And I found out as I took those things apart that there was a potentiometer in there, and that potentiometer was adjustable. And so it was about a 50,000 ohm potentiometer that was hooked into that system, so that, I don't know, it was a feedback, obviously, so that the cruise control module would know what it was doing with the throttle. And so what I would do is I'd get my meter, and I would measure both sides of that potentiometer, and I would adjust it so it was right in the middle. It was 25,000 each way, because it would be a slightly off, it could be 23 and 26 or something like that. And if I loosen that screw and I move that potentiometer to where it was dead in the middle, that would take care of that surge. That wasn't really a modification, it was more of an adjustment and that kind of thing. But just be really careful with that, you know, because if the car runs away because of something that you changed, then, you know, you can wind up in some really serious trouble because of that kind of thing. Okay, so anti-lock brakes is another thing. And airbags, you know, if you start messing around with airbags and airbag blows up in somebody's face or fails to deploy whenever somebody has an accident and they wind up getting injured because it failed to deploy, that's another issue. This 2004 Explorer, I saw 2 of these failures exactly the same way in 1 week, but I hadn't seen one since then. This balancer, you know, this outer pulley has actually got rubber bonding it to the inside. This is the harmonic balancer, and that pulley would break loose and slide back toward the timing cover, and it screwed that sensor up. It just chewed it up something awful, and so basically we had to replace that. I saw one that was a no start. We dragged it in and didn't have any crank signal. You look down there and you see this. You know, I had to put a balancer on it. It cost about $100 and a sensor. That was a very interesting failure, I thought. This Silverado light sensor, the little parts pipeline thing. One of my graduates was working at the local dealership, and he had, you know the daytime running lights on these Chevrolets of this vintage here. Whenever you've got it in drive during the daytime, this light sensor basically tells it when you're outside and you're driving and you don't have your headlights on and you don't have your park brakes on and all that. After about 45 minutes of moving it out in the sunlight, that light sensor has this module to turn those little daytime running lights on. Well, they're really annoying because these little suckers burn out all the time. You got to put bulbs in there. But the point is, those daytime running lights work whenever you're in drive. They don't work in park. They only work when you're in drive, and it takes them a while to come on. This guy, I had a couple of trainer vehicles that were outfitted with this. Well, this guy came over here and he said, I'm over here at the Chevrolet place, you know, where I put him to work. He made really good money there and still works there. But anyway, he says the daytime running lights wouldn't work on his truck, and he says, and so my diagnostics took me to replace his light sensor. It goes in the dash, and he says, and so I replaced the light sensor, and they still didn't work, and I replaced the light sensor again, and they still didn't work. And I said, well, here, take this potentiometer and dial in the voltage, you know, hook it to the 2 wires that plug into the light sensor and dial in the voltage where the lights are supposed to come on. He came back, he said, they work when I dial it in with that potentiometer, but they won't work with the light sensor plugged in. And I said, well, it sounds to me like you got a bad light sensor. I don't care if you did put 2 on there. He put a 3rd one on there, and it didn't work either. And then he came over there with throwing up his hands, and I says, take the one out of my trainer vehicle out there that you know is a good one and carry it back over there and plug it in and see what that does. That was all it needed, was a good light sensor. He got 3 bad ones. He had to buy 4 before he got a good light sensor. I've seen thermostats that, you know, like a vehicle with a cold running engine, and the thermostat would need to be replaced. I put a thermostat on out of the parts room, and this was at the Ford dealer, and it would still run cold. I put another one, put a 3rd one on there. Finally, the 3rd or the 4th thermostat you put in there starts running the normal temperature, which I thought that was kind of strange, but it was some kind of manufacturing defect there that you run into on that. But occasionally, that really will throw you for a loop if you change the part, and you change the part again, you change the part again, and none of them will make it work. But if you substitute something that is telling the truth, you know, which would be that little potentiometer dialing the voltage into where it was supposed to be. He got those numbers from the Chevrolet hotline, but they were mind-boggled that putting the sensor on there won't work. So just basically taking a known good one. And it was wacky back in the day when we were doing this electronics troubleshooting. The shop manual sometimes would tell you to swap out a module with a known good part. Well, that's fine if you've got access to a known good part, but when the parts people ordered something like that, if you plugged it in, they didn't want it back. You know, that was pretty annoying. All right, the old Duraspark issue that I had was on my, and I talked about this a while back, my F-150. I went, you might notice on these old Durasparks, on these old Fords, they basically have a hot end start wire, hot end run wire, and this thing was popping and snorting and trying not to run right. Just all of a sudden it started doing this. And so I turned it just past this position to the start position, and it ran better. And I went to the parts store that I was closest to, and they laid one on the counter, and I bought it, and then the truck wouldn't even start. It was kicking back and all that. So I went back in there, and he plugged it into his machine and said, no, this one here is good. Well, see, it would start with mine, but it wouldn't start with his. I mean, mine didn't run with the flip when you tried to drive it, but it would start and run the engine and sit there and idle. His wouldn't start the truck. So I went back in there, and I said, this don't work. So he says, well, let's get another one. He checked the other one on the same funky little tester he had over there, and it got all green lights, everything was fine. Plugged in, it still wouldn't start. So I called him out there, and I said, look, why won't your module start my truck? And so he said, well, I don't know, but you're doing something wrong. I said, well, watch this. So I plugged in my module again, and it fired up. And then I unplugged it, and I plugged in his module, and it wouldn't start. It sounded like the spark plug wires were crossed or something, kicking back. And he said, well, I just need to give you your money back, let you go somewhere else. So he did, and I went and bought a module that looked like that one. And that was I bought that one from Advanced Auto Parts. The other one I had bought at a different part store. But anyway, that was a little bit annoying. Here's a driveway fix that I did on a 2001 F-150. My buddy that was one of the other instructors said his son's truck wouldn't start. Well, his son had an issue with the water getting on the fuse panel, like on a lot of these trucks. And that's still a problem sometimes today. There will be a little water will leak past the windshield and drip on some of the electronics in there and cause all kinds of problems. And so he had to replace that junction box, which is all with different part numbers for different trucks. You got to get the right one. It's kind of expensive. They're hard to get nowadays because these trucks are as old as they are. Well, he got a junction box put on there, and it was fine for a couple of days, and then one day it wouldn't start there in the driveway. And he didn't know if he had a bad key or a bad junction box or what it was and all that. Well, what I managed to do when I went over there, when I tried to start it and I didn't get anything, I mean, I got nothing. It was like, passive any theft. And I went to the injector, and I basically checked the wire, the red wire going to the injector that comes from the EAT power relay. And I got this very, very, very dim test light. All right. Then I went over here to the fuse panel, and I found the EAT power relay. And with that test light still connected, I just thumped it with my finger, and that light suddenly got really bright. All he needed was a relay. He didn't need any keys or anything like that. See, part of what led him to think he might have a key or a junction box problem was his little theft light was blink, 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 blink. Well, a lot of the times the passive anti-theft is built into the instrument cluster, which is, I think, the way it was on that one. The instrument cluster was unable to talk to the engine controller because the engine controller was not awake because it's fed by the same wire that feeds the injectors. And so because it wasn't able to talk to the engine controller, the truck, it was blinking the theft light and it wasn't giving any starter operation or anything else. But all he needed to fix that one was a relay. But that's why, here's the other thing. If I had used an LED or one of these power probe things to check that LED would have probably lit up nice and bright, while this 1/4 of an amp test light bulb would not light up bright if there wasn't any current there. That's another reason why you need something that's going to pull some current. And that was the thing right there. See, the light touching the battery was the same. It ought to be the same. But what it amounted to, across the contacts on that relay, it was dropping a whole lot of voltage. And that was what the deal was there. What will this reading be? We're going to come back and I'm going to give you the answer to these questions, but right now I'm just going to let you get your paper and write down what you think that reading will be. If you need to pause the video while you're getting your paper, go ahead and do that. Why is this component being removed? How do you fix this? It's obvious that the hose has been rubbing on that. Number 4, an engine has good spark and fuel pressure and good power at the injectors, but no fuel injector ground faults on any injector. The most likely cause is bad ignition switch contact, a broken signal return wire at the TP sensor, a stuck open fuel pressure regulator, or a faulty PCM. Now once again, you're looking for the most likely cause. Which of the following is least likely to cause a no start? TP signal wire shorted to reference voltage, a ruptured fuel pressure regulator diaphragm, not diagram, A restricted fuel filter or a weak spark? Alright, which of the following is least likely to cause poor fuel economy? A restricted fuel filter, aftermarket running boards and bug shields, low tire pressure, or a restricted exhaust? That should be a fairly easy question there. All of the following are correct except the generator field on many late model cars is controlled by the PCM. The next one is, if an OBD2 controller is referred to as an ECM rather than a PCM, it doesn't control the transmission shifts. C, because of the additional oxygen, a lean exhaust stream is cooler than a rich exhaust stream. Or D, NOx is formed due to incomplete combustion. I think I screwed up when I wrote that question, and I'll tell you why in a minute. It's really something how I can go back when I'm doing these videos and see mistakes that I made writing the dadgum question. Duh. Alright, now let's back up. This reading is going to be 3 ohms. If you got two 6 ohm resistors wired in parallel, then that's additional current path. It's going to be 3 ohms. That question mark ought to be a 3. Alright, so I'm not going to go over the equations and everything, but we actually went over a similar question to this about how it's always less than the least. Well, if they're both the same, it's going to be half of whatever both of them are if they're wired parallel like that. Parallel is this way. If they were in series, it would have to go through both of them, and you multiply it. You know, you say 6 and 6 would be 12. This is the relief valve for the oil pump on a Power Stroke, and sometimes if there's gritty stuff that comes out of the oil pump and gets in here and causes that pressure relief valve to stick, then you won't have enough oil pressure. And so we basically need to take that out and make sure that there's not a lot of gritty stuff in there and that little valve is not stuck in there. That's why that would be taken out. I did that to one that was laying on the bench just to take that picture. Alright, this right here, most of you have probably seen something like this before. Somebody puts a caliper back on there with the hose twisted. And if you got to pay attention, you know, you can take that caliper and turn it up this way and do your work on it. And if you turn it another turn, you wind up with the hose like that. Now this could be an epic disaster if this had worn through that hose until the hose just suddenly started leaking. This could have caused some brake failure. A very simple rookie mistake like this can be extremely dangerous whenever somebody is trusting somebody to do brakes that's not familiar with brakes, and they didn't even notice this. They felt like if they could get the caliper back on and tighten the bolts, it'd be aight. Even if they put the pads on there with the lining toward the rotor, you know. An engine has good spark and fuel pressure and good power at the injectors, but no fuel injector ground pulse on any injector. Now, the fact that it's got good spark and fuel pressure indicates the engine controller's thinking, because you got good fuel pressure because it's running the fuel pump, and it's got good spark because that means your ignition system's popping and you got a crank signal. No fuel injector ground pulse on any injector. There's power going to the injectors, but it's not pulsing the ground of the injectors. If your signal return is broken at the throttle position sensor, what that will do is cause it to read wide open throttle. Now, every vehicle is not like this, but a lot of vehicles are. A vehicle that has a clear flood mode, if you push the accelerator pedal all the way to the floor and there's not gas puddled up in the manifold or something, it typically will just spin over and it won't ever operate the injectors. Well, if the throttle position sensor on one that's outfitted this way has a wide open throttle signal, then you're going to have no injector operation. If you unplug the the throttle position sensor and it fires up, it'll give you that. Or if you back probe it and you see 5 volts there, or what it considers wide open throttle, you see. Alright, so a stuck open fuel pressure regulator is not going to do it, neither will it. Now, faulty PCM, maybe, you know, if your fuel pressure regulator had a busted diaphragm and it was pumping fuel through the vacuum line into the intake, wetting the plugs, that might cause it not to start. But you're typically going to have a hydraulic lock then. Bad ignition switch contact's a possibility, but the most likely cause would be that one there because of the fact that you don't have any power, you don't have any ground pulse at the injectors. Which of the following is the least likely to cause a no start? The least likely would be a restricted fuel filter. sometimes people would claim they changed the fuel filter because their car wouldn't start, but if the fuel filter is stopped up that bad, you got bigger problems than just a stopped up fuel filter. Typically a fuel filter, the symptoms you'll get from that is it'll start and run just fine, but it won't accelerate whenever you're in a hard pull. It will basically start to, you know, lose power and stuff like that. On those old TBI engines like Chevrolet had, when the filter stopped up, it feels like the catalytic converter clogged. I mean, it's just sluggish all the way across the board, which is really weird. Okay, now this is one I screwed up on. Which of the following is least likely to cause pure fault? Well, this is obviously not going to cause pure fuel economy. If anything, it's going to improve it because you ain't going to be in it as heavy and it's going to get better fuel. Aftermarket running boards will have wind resistance and that will screw that up. Low tire pressure can cause it. No, excuse me, the next one's the one I screwed up on, not this one. Restricted exhaust will cause it. This will not cause it. This can cause it, that can cause it, that can cause it, that goes. So the answer to this one is A. This is the one I messed up. Alright, because of additional oxygen, a lean exhaust stream is cooler than a rich. That's wrong. This is actually a lean exhaust stream is hotter than a rich exhaust stream. That was a screw up when I wrote the question. And NOx is not formed due to incomplete combustion. So both of these are incorrect right here. NOx is formed because of high combustion chamber temperatures, not because of incomplete combustion. Alright, incomplete combustion is actually, you got less NOx with incomplete combustion than you do with complete combustion. The generator fuel late, this is a true statement. And this one right here is a true. Electronic or engine control module is what they call it if it's not controlling the transmission. PCM's controlling the engine and the transmission. Okay, that's about all I got for you today, and I really appreciate you guys stopping by, and I hope you enjoy the videos, and I hope you'll tell a friend to come check it out.